Good morning. My name is Bob Boccalini. I'm president of the Certified Court Reporters Association of New Jersey. Today is July 13th, 2013. With me today is Carol Farrell, a certified court reporter, and Mr. Robert Tate, a certified court reporter who is videotaping this interview. We are in the home of Pastor Albert Alspach in Ocean City, New Jersey. We are interviewing the pastor under the Veterans History Project. This interview will be submitted and archived in the United States Library of Congress. Good morning, Pastor, and thank you so much for inviting us into your home. Pastor, would you tell us about where you were born and in what year, please?
Philadelphia, 1936.
Were you born in a hospital?
Hahnemann Hospital, Broad Street, Philadelphia.
You told me earlier that you have two brothers. Are they younger or older, or a combination of?
I was the baby of four, two brothers and a sister.
Mm-hmm. And would you be kind enough to tell us a little bit about your parents and your life as your early life as a boy in Philadelphia?
My mother, her family go back many years as far as the military is concerned. Her father fought in the Spanish-American War as a Marine, and her grandfather was with the 21st Cavalry Regiment of Pennsylvania during the Civil War. When her dad was discharged from the Marine Corps, got a job first in Atlantic City, driving a trolley, horse-driven trolley, and then got a better job in Pennsylvania in a factory that made bricks. And in his first week there, on a Thursday, he was caught in a conveyor belt and crushed to death. My mother was the oldest of four children. The youngest was 2 months old. My mother was 11. A man knocked, tells me, she was just learning to knit. And there was a knock at the door. My grandmother went to the door, and the man from the factory said, Mrs. Taylor, I have some bad news. He was welcomed in, and she said, let me get my coat, I'll go right with you. And he said, no, Lawrence is gone. Well, that began then a very difficult time. My grandmother took in wash to survive with these four children. My mother, at 11 years of age, was taken out of school. She was an excellent student. Taken out of school and sent to work in a quilting factory. And so, not much of a life. And then she met my dad in, let me see, father was born in 1900, she was born in 1905. So in 1926 they were married. My father's background goes way back to 1642 when two Alspach brothers came over from Germany, farmers, settled in Pennsylvania, Dutch country. And then gradually they moved west and so forth, and kind of lost the identity. Although my father spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, the last one to do so in the family, but when he would converse with his mother, my grandmother, they would converse in Pennsylvania Dutch. When I went to college, my first year, took German, came home for a vacation, and told them about, learning German. I said something, and he says, I understand every word you're saying. And I said, well, of course you do, because you speak German. He says, no, I do not. they had lost completely the knowledge that they were originally Germans. He said, we're not German. We hated the Germans. He's talking about World War I, you know, and so forth. And I said, well, what do you think when they say Pennsylvania Dutch? He said, well, we're Dutch. I said, no, you're Deutsch. When the people, you know, would meet these immigrants and they'd say, where are you from? Ich bin Deutsch. Well, to the English-speaking people who didn't know German, well, that obviously means Dutch. So they were given that name. These are Pennsylvania Dutch people. So they lost that connection. Although we were eating basically the same food that they ate in Germany 250 years ago, but lost the identification. So anyway, they had then 3 children. The Depression hit. Living in Philadelphia, things were very bad. And my mother realized she was pregnant again and decided that there was just no way they could handle that. And so she went to one of the back streets there in Philadelphia and arranged for an abortion. It would be $5, and she had to put $2 down. Which she did. And the day came for the appointment, and she felt so guilty about this that she told my father that I am pregnant and we cannot feed another child. So I've made this arrangement and I go tomorrow. And my father, who was much more laid back, I guess, said, you are not going back to that woman. I don't care about we're losing $2, but you're not going back there. If we can feed 3, we can feed 4. Hence I was born. You see how these little things determine so much. Everything. Determined everything. For me. But anyway, I was a Depression child, and so it was a very difficult time. But they managed. My father did anything at all in order to survive it. The saving thing, of course, ironically, and so often in history, war. And war pulled us out of the Depression. Father got a war job, made $100 a week, which he had never made anything like that. And when the war ended, he lost that job and never made that again. But it meant then that we had the ability to escape a very bad life in northeast Philadelphia at 16th and Cumberland and move to South Jersey, which we did. And only a few months later, the war ended. But that's when things then... So that's the story basically of my parents, the background. My father went to the 4th grade. My mother got to the 7th grade before she had to, of course, go to work. So they were not educated people, and were not, well, they were sympathetic. They were good, very good, loving people, but they had no understanding at all about anything other than their own situation. So that when teachers, right from the beginning, would call my mother in and say, you know, you are preparing for higher education for this child. And my mother would just, you know, say, well, thank you, you know, very much. But of course, they couldn't do it financially, but it was my mother's concern that when I stuck to my guns with all my teacher support and everything and actually went to college, that at the last minute when I had sent in $25 for the room deposit at Rutgers, my mother came up to wake me up for my summer lawn cutting job and said, this has come. They want $25 right away. if you want, I'll just send them a note back and say you're not coming. And I said, but I am going. I'll get the $25, and I am going. And she explained that what you're doing is going to make you so unhappy because you're going to be meeting people that have so much more than we do. They live in a different world, and that will be very hurtful, you know. So it would be much better, you know, as your brothers have done, your sister, out of high school, you get a job, and you know, and begin your life where you are. This is the people that we are. So that became a very bitter thing for me until basically my senior year at Rutgers, when I was so dumb, but finally in my senior year began to realize that they can never understand what I'm about, what I'm doing. But I understand where they're coming from and why they're taking that position. So I have to be kind of the big person in all of this. Because I know they love me and so forth. They will never understand. But I know that their intentions are absolutely loving. Yeah. Well, that made it a lot easier. So when I, like after my sophomore year, came home the summer after my sophomore year and said, I'm going to go to Italy and study there for a year. And they just couldn't believe this. But they did take me up to New York. I had my ticket on the Andrea Doria. Does that ring a bell, the Andrea Doria? I had my ticket on that, and it was coming over to pick me up there in New York, and it sunk. I was working for the post office at 4 a.m. in the morning, sorting mail, and the guy next to me said, what's the name of that Italian tub that you're going over on? And I said, you know, they were always kidding me about this. I said, you know the name. He said, no, what's the name of it? I said, the Andrea Doria. He says, it's gone down. Right. So I figured, you know, he's fooling around. He said, we'll listen to the radio when we go for coffee, which we did, and that was the news. The Andrea Doria went down. A few days later, I had a wire from the Italian line saying Andrea Doria sunk, and that they were booking me on the Giulio Cesare, bringing it up from the South American route, and so forth. So my parents took me there to get on that boat. I'll never forget the look on my mother's face. They were playing Arrivederci Roma on the deck of this Italian boat. And there is Albert. Goodbye. This unbelief. He's actually going. Yeah. No money. Harriet. And ended up surviving. You know, I'd write home and say, sell my French horn and send me the income tax refund. Send that, and so forth. Went 5 days in Rome on one occasion with nothing to eat, zero. Just kept drinking and drinking and heading 3 miles to the American Express office, hoping that my parents had sent the wire in French, when they sold the French horn, that I would have that. But when I notified them that this is really important, that they do this, that 5 days for them to get my letter, I couldn't afford a wire. So I sent them an airmail letter, 5 days. So anyway, for those 5 days then, there was nothing. One of the great years of my life, wandering all around Europe, packed bicycle, and so forth. Come back to Rutgers knowing really what I wanted to do. Henry Rutgers Scholar in my senior year, where I was freed of most of the requirements and did basically master's work with 3 tutors. Great year. And then applied to Columbia to major in musicology at Columbia University. Well, what else?
Had you played music from your younger years as a child?
music was a big part of our life. My father was quite musical, totally untrained and everything, but he had the gift of a wonderful lyric tenor voice. He had a beautiful voice, which of course he could never refine or cultivate or take lessons or anything. But he sang in various choral groups because he enjoyed it so much. And during the war, my parents, had the resources that they could get piano lessons from my sister. And I remember vividly during the Depression when people, their only source of, I guess, comfort and sociability was to go to one another's homes. And we would have cold cuts and beer on the table, Limburger cheese and onions and rye bread and all of that kind of thing. And then gather around the piano where we sang all of these old songs. I can sing a couple of them if you want. Do you know Little Sir Echo? No, you don't remember any of this. Even Carol doesn't go that back that far. And maybe you do. Do you know Little Sir Echo? No. Anyway, and I love those evenings when all these people would gather and obviously enjoy themselves so much. And music was the source of that. So yes, it became very much a part of my life. And when I went to high school, and we had a music appreciation course, and I'll never forget, I can still see it, being in the music room, and the band director who had to teach this course, I think very reluctantly, but nonetheless, he taught it, and he dropped the needle on this 33.5 RPM record of the Moldau, a classical piece by Smetana, and it really knocked me out of my chair. And after the class, I went up to him and said, would it be possible if I could come back sometime after school and hear that again? And he said, well, certainly, you can do that, which I did. That was my introduction then to classical music and became an obsession, I guess, still going on. But that's how I got then into, went to Rutgers, got a state scholarship there, and liberal arts degree and so forth. Great time. So that was the music thing.
So when you finished at Columbia, now we're into 1959, 1960, around that era?
Yes, I graduated Rutgers 59, so I started 59 fall at Columbia, yes.
And can you tell us about your status under the draft, the Army draft, Armed Forces draft at that time?
Yes. When you graduated high school at that time, you were classified, because the draft was still in effect, I guess basically from the Korean thing. What were we talking about?
I think you were A1 when you graduated from high school.
Right. You had to register immediately for the draft, and then you were given A1 status. You could request deferment, basically for things like school, and which I did, and did that successfully for 4 years at Rutgers, 1 year in Italy, Columbia. And then the draft board, after back and forth all the time, said, "That's it. Your time is up. You're going to have to come in." And so that's how that worked.
And then when you reported to the draft board, eventually, because you had to,
Right.
tell us that story and how you sort of enlisted.
Right. Well, if you were a student in those days, the country was no longer at war, things like that. this draft thing was something of a hardship, I guess. If you were a school teacher, if you were a scientist, and most of my friends were in those categories, engineering, stuff like that, you could get deferred because of your profession. But not my profession. You didn't get deferments if you were in the arts. So there was always this kind of threat nipping at you, and I saw it as that. It was an interruption to one's life, which of course the draft is. You have to stop whatever you're doing, if you're working or if you're a student or whatever, and you stop and you are drafted for 2 years. Well, when they said such and such a date, you report, and I did. And I went through the physical and all of that business. My first physical, that was another thing we could not afford as children during the Depression and so forth. The only time I think we went to the doctor was my brother in a snowstorm went into the back of a truck and broke his leg, and so he had to be hospitalized. But other than that, you know, if you got sick, my mother would always say, get up and walk around. We can walk it off. And so you did. And you were rewarded with milk toast. That was another thing. My mother suffered, as her dad did, terribly of migraine headaches. He had to be armed as a trolley driver in Atlantic City. He had to have a pistol with him. Times haven't changed, I guess, very much, but he told his employers that he could not take the gun. He was to take the gun with him. And he said, I cannot take the gun home. And they said, well, it's part of the requirement. He says, well, then I'll have to give up the job. He knew, he said, that if he had that at home and a migraine would strike, he would use it. Well, my mother inherited those migraine, suffered all of her life with it, and I also did. I had 50 years of migraine, basically free of it almost completely now, for which I give much thanks and wonder how we ever survived it all. But anyway, that was another thing. I went through the Army with experience with migraine and all the rest of it. So that was was interviewed after the physical and so forth. You've passed everything and so forth, and you'll report to Fort Dix for basic training, so forth. The man I spoke to said, with your educational background and so forth, I got to tell you that if you get to Dix, being drafted, 2-year obligation, whatever we need that day is where you'll be assigned. If we need cooks, you'll be a cook, so forth and so on. However, because of your background and so forth, you could be assigned, if you would enlist, 1 more year to something of your choice, not our choice, and things like the Army Security Agency, where you would be among highly educated people, so forth and so on. Well, being naive, as I still am, I believed him, and I signed up for the 3rd year. 3-year enlistment, Army Security Agency, basic training Fort Dix, followed by training at Fort Devens in Massachusetts with the Army Security Agency.
And after you finished your basic training, and I would imagine along with the security training, you did basic training, learned how to shoot a rifle. And
yeah, that was basic training.
Those kinds of things.
We didn't do the rifle thing in the security agency, but,
yeah.
Well, we did because it was required in the Army, but yeah.
And after you finish basic training, you're off to?
Fort Devens, Massachusetts.
And what was your role at Fort Devens? What was your assignment there?
Well, you were to go to school there for about 4 months, Before then, you would go to one of our security bases. And basically, the work. First of all, you had to get a clearance, a security clearance. The top one, which is a cryptological clearance. They went back to Lindenwold and interviewed our neighbors, and a very thorough type of thing, But I got that clearance. You had to have it in order to do that work. And while then at Devon's, in those within I guess the first month that I was there, I got to know basically what this job was going to be about. I thought, this is going to be mostly very boring. There was a Lutheran chaplain on post who would go over the new people coming into the post when they came in. He saw Alspach, Lutheran, with all this music background and so forth, and decided he needed an assistant and that he would see what could work out. He asked to see me, and I saw him, and he said that he thinks that he could do this. Well, I found it very attractive because I could continue working then in the music field, have my own office and all of that. So I said, well, if you can do it, yes, let's do it. And he did it. And I became then a chaplain assistant at Fort Devens under Johansson, and then 2 other chaplains that succeeded him until my orders came to be transferred to a post in Yorkshire, England. I guess it was about a little more than a year I was at Devens, 15 months, I guess, and then went to England, which was a tremendous assignment, a small security post on top of a moor in Yorkshire, where I established then a music program there and had the choir work and taught in the recreation center and a music history and appreciation course, and planned trips. The Army would provide us transport to operas and concerts and theater. And during the time that I was there, we did more than 40 of those trips that were very popular. So it was a grand experience.
And was that at Menwith Hill?
Yes.
Your base, which was sort of a joint United States Royal Air Force base, maybe?
Well, it wasn't a joint. We weren't supposed to be there. We were Army, and the agreement after World War II was that the English said, of course, you can have all of your Air Force bases here because it's basically for our protection as well, but no Army, no more Army personnel. They remember when the Yanks were flooding onto that island in World War II by the millions, literally. They were already kind of hungry because they had been in the war for some time before America got interested. And they didn't have a positive thing about these Yanks. He said they had the expression, they're oversexed, they're overpaid, and they're over here. So that was kind of so war ended. We don't want any more Army bases and so forth, but the Air Force can be here. So we were there kind of quietly. Near us was another security post, but which was a British security post. They were basically doing the same mission as we were, but independent of one another.
Who at that time was the biggest security military threat to the United States?
Well, Russia.
While you were stationed there, were you doing security work, surveillance work yourself?
Rarely, because the work took a lot of training, which I did not stay long enough at Fort Devens for that. So no, I did not go down to headquarters, which was heavily, you know, it was a very secure type of thing. And so no, I wasn't exposed to that. The basic mission of the post was to overhear, interpret messages that the Russians were sending to one another and to their allies in codes. When they would move forces, for instance, to a certain area, that was all had to be planned, transport, gas, trucks, so forth and so on. So that all had to be done in code, as we did. We did everything in code, so that they didn't know if we were moving forces in any way, which may signal something happening. So you would listen in to these, and if something kind of was strange, you know, well, now this, for 3 days, we've been getting all of these messages about movement, troop movements. Is there something going on here? Well, as soon as they were aware that we broke their code, they changed the code, as we did. And so it was that game that was being played all the time. So it was one of these complicated things of like listening in on somebody else's phone conversation and trying to figure out who is this person and what are they really doing, you know, not what they're saying, but what they're really doing. So that was our mission, which I'm sure continues to this day.
And during that period of time in the early 1960s, while you were stationed there, does the United States involvement in Vietnam and Southeast Asia escalate during your time in England?
Yes. The Cuba crisis was at that time. I remember being called out in the middle of the night onto the parade grounds there, and the sergeant announcing that he was from Alabama, and he said, "There's trouble in Cuba." And explained that we are now on red alert, and every man will carry a loaded rifle, and we're going to have people out on the sheep meadows and so forth, patrolling the post and all of that kind of thing. But Vietnam, when I went in the Army, was an unknown thing. No one ever heard of Vietnam. And when I did my basic training at Fort Dix, you go out to the rifle range, and the targets that you were shooting at, the dummies that you were bayoneting, were all Ivan, Russian. But in the middle of that, they changed the targets to Asian faces. And you're stabbing now Asians. And so what's going on? And then we were called in to see these films and lectures and things, and they had the map, and they had Vietnam. Oh, that's Vietnam, you know. And all of this was kind of in preparing us and the public. For instance, when I was doing basic training, they had long ago not used live ammunition for the training. That changed when I was in basic training, and everything, they fired machine guns over our heads when we were crawling through the barbed wire. Lost a couple people, a kid who out on the, we were learning with throwing the grenades and everything, and a big high school football player, you know, and he put this behind his ear, and there was a sergeant in the foxhole there, and he would say, "Pull," and you would pull the pin on this grenade, which is now it's live. "Throw," and you were to throw it as far as you could, because it was live. Now all live ammunition. this kid froze. He had the pulled grenade in his hand, was ordered to throw, and he just was paralyzed. And the man continued, the sergeant, to shout at him, "Throw!" And there was a tower in the distance that could watch all of this going on, and they realized, oh my God, Well, the kid dropped it at his feet, and the sergeant made a dash for it, and the kid made a dash for it, and they were both killed. So it was a different time. The gases, when the gas training and everything, they used the real gas and not kind of tear gas to kind of condition you to that. If you breathe in this other stuff, your lungs are going to be blistered and so forth. So you realize that, boy, we're getting serious here. We're revving up to something major that's coming down. Well, of course it did, and that was Vietnam. A couple kids in my choir were sent to Vietnam. Were given $500 clothing allowance because you couldn't wear a uniform. And it was 2 or 3 months later, my lead tenor, who was sent over there, notice came back that he had been killed in what they called an elevator accident. Well, the hard reality was that things were getting serious in Vietnam, and Americans were enemy, and so you became targets. He was the last one to be sent there because of his knowledge. The Army security people's knowledge could not go into the hands of the enemy, so they would be withdrawn from any area that was in any way fragile.
To avoid being captured, of course.
Right.
And then while you were stationed in England there, I think you told me earlier, if you left the base, you could not wear your military attire.
Right.
And what was the reason for that?
Because we weren't supposed to be there. We were Army, and the Army was not to be there. And so what we did there and everything was, of course, highly classified, and the English were always trying to guess what the hell's going on there at Manwith Hill. Their favorite theory was that it was underwater submarine fueling station. All kinds of good products. But they didn't know what was going on, and all of that. And if you started dating an English girl in town, there was a lot of security on that. And if you decided, I want to marry this girl, then you were sent back to the States. You could no longer, because it would be too much of a security risk. Those kinds of things.
Can you tell us about that jacket you're wearing?
Yes, this is my fatigue jacket that was issued to me at Fort Dix in basic training. And has survived, as I have, all of these years, now over 50 years, and in pretty good shape.
Can you show us those patches on your sleeves?
Yeah, can you see this? That's would be familiar to anybody that's been in the service or so forth. That signifies Specialist 5th Class, which would be kind of Staff Sergeant in the normal thing. And of course, that's my name. I had to be reminded of that every once in a while, so I always keep that there, and I often pronounce it backwards, which confuses people. But and this is the Army Security patch. All Army Security people would have that on their uniform.
So how many years did you spend there on that base in England until your discharge?
A little less than 2 years, I would say. Yeah, and it was a great experience.
But at the time that you were ready to leave the armed services, something very exciting happened in your life.
Well, yes. Since I was directing chapel choirs, of course, I was then exposed to worship, Christian worship. I had dropped all of that basically during high school, but it was part of the job description, and some of the chaplains would kind of turn over the whole thing to me. I would select the hymns and so forth, and do all of those kinds of arrangements and so forth. So I did that. But I was exposed then to some very highly educated people in my choir who were attending chapel services on a regular basis. And I thought, do they really believe this? Started reading C.S. Lewis. That may be a familiar name to some people, especially the Narnia series, books for children and so forth. But he was what they call a Christian apologist, where he kind of described what Christianity was about on a much more intellectual basis, not the kind of the born again that I was brought up with. And I got more and more fascinated. I also was fascinated by, I had lawyers and doctors and nurses and so forth in my choir who were believers. And I thought, well then, these people obviously are not stupid. How do they get to this? And I decided that I want to find out how. I want to know what it's about. And the thing to do, of course, is to study theology. And so, in my last months at the Army post, I was arranging retreats at various places in England and taking groups of GIs on these religious retreats. Again, because it was part of my duties, but then would listen to these people that were running these retreats and so forth, especially the English theologians and everything, and became more and more. I thought, I'm going to find out more about this. I know if I go back to the States, because the plan was to go back to the Rutgers faculty in the music department, that will be it. So I'm going to stop right here. I have no responsibilities other than to myself. So I decided to apply to Oxford University to read theology. And took a 3-day pass from the Army, went down there, took the entrance exam, and was accepted. Major change, of course. Army time is coming to an end. I was very friendly with a number of English people while in the Army who were very gracious. They would invite GIs to their homes on Sunday afternoon for a home-cooked meal, you know, kind of thing. And I got very close to a particular family, the McGoverns, Roman Catholic, very pious Roman Catholic. Hugh McGovern studied for the priesthood in Rome, did not complete those studies, and had 40 pubs, manager of 40 pubs in England. That's the way he made his living. Anyway, when I came back and they said, well, what happened, you know? And I said, well, I've been accepted. Well, they thought this was glorious. And I said, but I just don't see how I can do it. Why? Well, you know, they have these long, what they call VACs. You have 8 weeks of classes, tutorials, and all that stuff, and then 6 weeks of reading and so forth, and you go home to do that. Well, I, of course, couldn't do that. And I always remember Hugh McGovern saying to me, do you realize that an Englishman would give his right arm to go to Oxford? And you're telling me that you don't think you're going to go. Now, what are the problems? And we start talking about, he said, you will make your home here with us. No cost, so forth. And so because of that, I said, well then, all right, we'll do it. So I got my enlistment extended by 3 months so that I could get 3 more paychecks. before beginning at Oxford, and took off the uniform one day, and Hugh drove me down to Oxford, and I put on my gown there the next day, and that whole new chapter began.
And of course that led to your further studies, theology, and your post-Army career.
Yes. And, you know, all made possible. There was the GI Bill, which of course we still have. I was eligible. You got 1 month for every month you served. So I had 39 months of benefits. They paid, I think $200 a month. I don't know if it was that much. I think it was $200 a month. And I was able to get that during my studies then in theology. And people that I met in the choir, met in the Army, sang in my choir, who will be visiting with me next week here in Ocean City. Very staunch Lutherans. When they heard about this, I was a godfather for their youngest child and so forth, and we were in constant contact, said, we will send you $200 a month during the next years. Basically, it would be 4 years. So, you know, that Army connection again, of people like that, the McGoverns and the Shiles and the GI Bill and things all kind of coming together and making something like, you know, my mother, how the hell can you pull that off? Live in England and go to Oxford. To them, Oxford, you know, was something like, it was either heaven or hell. I don't think she was ever convinced which one. Probably leaned toward hell. But it was all possible. All possible because of something I was very reluctant about, like the draft turning out to be an opening of so many doors in my life.
And after you left Oxford, you come back to the United States, continue your studies.
I had to decide after reading theology at Oxford for 2 years that where was I going to live this out? What was I going to do with it? I was very close to the Roman Catholic chaplain there at Oxford. I went on pilgrimage to Lourdes for a couple of weeks as a brancardier, carrying the stretchers around to the baths and so forth in Lourdes. Did an article, A Lutheran at Lourdes, and all of that kind of experience. And he was very influential. I realized then that I had to decide, it would have to be a liturgical church, none of the fundamentalism stuff. So it had to be a bona fide, theologically sound institution. Well, Roman Catholic would qualify, Anglican or Episcopalian, and Lutheran. 3 liturgical churches. Had some problems with some of the Roman Catholic theology, liked Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, and in fact the Anglican Church said to me while I was at Oxford, if you will remain in this country for 5 years after you get your ordination, we would ordain you in the Anglican Church, and you would serve in a parish for us. After that, if you want to go back to the States and so forth, that's up to you, but we will pay for it all. So that was another, you know, temptation. But music again, Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach was a Lutheran, and great, you know, writer of a church. He was a believer, and it comes through everything that he did. So that it came down to that, and I said, well, if it was good enough for Bach, it will be good enough for me. Plus, they had a very good, sound theology. So, I decided then that I would do that and applied then in the States to be ordained in the New Jersey Synod of the American Lutheran Church. And they said, well, you have to go to seminary here. So that began another thing, it's like with the draft board and so forth. They were finally convinced that the theologians over here said, look, if this guy is doing 2 years at Oxford reading theology, how can we possibly say we don't recognize that here in America, you know? So they changed their mind about that the first time that it happened, and they said, well, all right, but you will have to do 2 more years in America. So we're 4 years altogether, and I was ordained in the Lutheran Church, the LCA, Lutheran Church in America. Went to seminary in Philadelphia, and got my first parish in Bethany, Belleville, New Jersey, a suburb of Newark. At that time, Vietnam was a very divisive issue in the country. 1967, I got very involved in that. Most clergy, still true today, never had military experience. They didn't get drafted. So I had that dimension that they did not have. Anyway, I had great interests. I organized high school students who were picketing and so forth against the war in Vietnam, and got together with these kids and said, you know, I'm on your side, but you're eliciting such a negative response in general in the public. What do these kids know? They're just getting out of school today or whatever. So I would go down every morning when the high school doors were open, and everything was locked up at this time because of the student rebellions that were going on. And we would gather, and we'd have kind of this pep rally, you know, and I would try to stress that we've got to do this peacefully. We're not asking for special favors. We're simply asking for justice, that our voices be heard. And I said, the most positive thing you can do, those of you who are seniors and can vote, 18 years of age, should be voting. This was, you know, in November, should be voting with the candidates and so forth that you agree with and everything. And therefore you must register. And we're going to arrange for transport right after school to go to the town hall and register and so forth. And we did that, and it was a very positive type of thing. Got in all kinds of trouble, you know. I had to go with some of the leaders to the principal of the high school and everything, and he said, well, you're here asking mercy for these kids. I said, no, we're not asking for mercy. We're just simply asking for justice, and are willing to take whatever punishment, you know, if we're going to be, whatever the punishment then, you know, was that they can do with the students and so forth. These kids stand ready to take it because they believe it's worthy of the whatever punishment may come their way. That's all we're asking. So it was a great time. That came from my, again, experience in the Army by being drafted, enlisted type of thing.
How did the church leaders view your activism at the time?
Very divided. Yeah. Very divided. I had in my congregation some German immigrants that went through World War II and were very, very sensitive to all this thing. And we did various, I did services at the church, prayers for peace and so forth. Would have the the bell tolling from the tower there. It was a busy intersection. A big sign in the front, "Don't ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." And we had crosses on the lawn, and I had organized these parades going around with the things, all very peacefully done. And about half of the clergy participated in it. I had a Nazi flag that my uncle in World War II brought home and gave me, and I had that hanging there at the church door. And of course, the Miller family was very offended by that, and I had all I could do to kind of justify what we're doing here and why we're doing it. So yes, there was great division. There was also great riots in Newark, which you may remember at that time. Tony Imperiali, who organized like a fascist type of group that wore the brown shirts and so forth. And I was with the commission on the town with race relationships and so forth, and he invaded Belleville with his group, and we marched up the steps to this meeting with my black friends, a couple of clergy, into this, and these guys are standing there with their arms crossed that do we dare go in that door, you know, which we did. And we were joined by a number of nuns, and when the nuns went in, they were surrounded by these guys. This kind of blocked their way on the aisle. They didn't touch them or say anything to them, but they just kind of made it difficult. So those kinds of things were all going on, and my Army experience equipped me, I think, for a lot of those difficult times.
Pastor, we're just at the end of this videotape. So
okay.
if we can take a pause, we'll change the tape, we'll start it up again, and we'll finish up today with sort of the balance of your career and into your retirement years. So
okay.
Let's take a quick break.
All right, thank you.
So, Pastor, after your involvement there in Bellevue, not only
Belleville,
pardon me.
Suburb of Newark.
Yes, not only in the church, but in the surrounding community, obviously. Can you tell us what you eventually did from there?
Right, well, while in Belleville, since I was 20 minutes from Manhattan, and New York is one of my favorite places, center of the world, certainly culturally, and so was in there a lot. And the, where was I going with that?
Well, you left Belleville, did you?
Oh, yes, I decided, well, you know, I should continue, force of habit, I guess, education. And so I went to Princeton Theological Seminary on a one-day-a-week type of thing for 3 years and got a master's in theology there at Princeton. And then to Union Seminary in Manhattan, which was kind of, at that time, the mecca of all theological study in America. It's where Bonhoeffer and Tillich and all of these greats taught, and was doing doctoral work there until leaving Belleville, went to Darien, Illinois, a suburb of to Lord of Life Lutheran Church that had been established about 10 years ago before that, and was doing well, and parishioners that were in my Bethany congregation who were from the Midwest went back to he was the manager of Avis in New York. I went back to Chicago, and the phone rang one evening, and it was Paul, and he said, "Would you consider coming out here and taking a parish?" And I said, "Well, you're out of the loop here, Paul. This all has to be done through the bishop." And he said, "Well, I'm just kind of testing the water. If you're not, then there's no point in going to the bishop." So forth. I said, "Yeah, I would be interested." It was a fascinating group, and I make a long story short. I went to Darien, Illinois. Congregation had been established 10 years. It had about 250 children and 3 senior citizens. So it was quite a different group from the kind of Belleville, New Jersey group. And they were hungry. And what I did, they were there. So I did all kinds of courses in theology and in music and in art and everything, and they were just amazing that way. So they were also great years in the Midwest, and after about 5 years, phone rang again, and it was the Bishop in New Jersey, and who I had served with on various committees some years before, and he said had lunch with Bill Rush. He's a friend of Pope Benedict, and he's a theologian, early church patristics, and I met at Oxford. We remained friends over the years. He said, was telling me about, what's going on out there in Illinois, and Bishop Herluf Jensen said, "Do you think Al would be interested in maybe coming back to Jersey?" Bill said, "Give him a call." And he did. And I said, "Well, I'm interested." And he described the parish here in Ocean City that was going through a very difficult time. I missed the East Coast. And my both parents died while I was out there in Darien. And I thought, I think I might want to go back. We were shoebies. You know what shoebies are? My mother would pack a lunch in a shoebox, and my father would get gas during the war, which was hard to get, and we would come down here for a day at the beach, and with our shoebox lunch. And so I have fond memories from as long as I can remember of Ocean City, New Jersey. So when I heard Ocean City and everything, and they had a beautiful parsonage up in the gardens, and I said, I'm going to do it. So I did it, and that's how I got here to Ocean City and served approximately 15 years in the parish here at St. John's. Realized 23 years ago, 24 years ago, that had nice parishes, places to live, but they weren't mine. They were congregational owned, of course, and that soon I'd be on the street. And I wasn't prepared for that at all, with the money we make and so forth, you're not stashing it away. So I thought, I'm going to have to do something. And I did, and sold most of my autograph collection, which I regret to this day. I had an Emily Dickinson letter, and oh God, it makes me, you should cut the camera because I'm going to start to cry, but it enabled me to get a down payment on this place that was just being built. And when I climbed up the rafters here and everything, I looked out, I didn't know that there was a lagoon out there, and so I thought, this would be great, Hence, 23 years ago, bought this place, and I'm still paying for it, still have about years to go. And Anybody out there that might be watching this would like to have a nice place and pick up the mortgage, I would appreciate it very much.
Well, of course, it probably doesn't show on our camera, but you have an indescribable, to me, collection of books.
That could be negative, indescribable. Interesting.
Maybe you can describe it for us.
I describe it as clutter because it has everything from Egypt to the present, all juxtaposed together. Have you been to the Barnes Museum, Albert Barnes, the new museum in Philadelphia? We were kindred spirits. We shared a first name. And his place is like this, and the museum's like this. He had Picasso next to Rembrandt, and so forth. And was constantly changing, moving things. Wake up at night and say, you know, I think the Picasso would be better next to the Renoir. So, and I do that all the time. As you know, when you things are stable, you don't see them anymore. You know, you move it, and it's new again. You know, because you weren't used to seeing it there, like that Cezanne. You know. That's a lady's scarf that I got at a Cezanne exhibit and stretched over white cardboard. And it looks like Cezanne's painting. I could sell it to you if you have time. Anyway, that's what this place is like. But moving on.
Do you still see some family and friends?
You mean like in retirement type of thing?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I still, well, Charlie and Fran Shiles, North Carolina, are going to be here next week. That were in my choir. Fran was alto. Charlie was my lead tenor. I couldn't have done without him. And I'm God Father for his youngest. And I have a number of Army buddies that I have kept in contact with over the years. Within the past year, we all went, 4 of us went on the Queen Mary 2 back to England and back to the Army base where we were stationed up at Menwith Hill. And an English woman that was very active there in the chapel, sang in my choir and helped me arrange all of these trips and so forth, is still alive, keeps in constant contact. And said, we're thinking about coming. And so she called the post, and it's still, of course, very closed, but she was able to arrange that when we went over there, we got onto the post, and of course, tremendous changes have occurred since we were there. But it was great to have this time after all of these years with these guys, because we have kept in contact over all of these years. And when I think of these people that, you know, again, without the Army thing, I never would have met these people. You meet people who are in your own town or who are in your office at work, maybe church, a little larger group, you know, that you get exposed to. But with the Army, you have no choice. Well, I don't want to be with those people. Well, tough. They're now your boss. You know, that type of thing. Well, you know, this changes things.
You talked about that, and you talked about your perspective and the positive light that you now show on your Army career, even in light of how you sort of resisted becoming involved. So you have a different perspective about your service and what it's meant in your life now.
Yes, it was a very critical dimension of my life that I thought, you know, I was certainly reluctant, and if I could have avoided it, I would have avoided it. But when I think of all of the people and the doors that were opened as a result of those Army years, I realized that probably more than anything else in my life, it's had the biggest impact on my life that continues to this day. And therefore, I see great value in everybody having that experience of taking on something that they would rather not do because it's interrupting my life, you know, or I don't want to be in that part of the country or that part of the world. I don't want to be with these kind of people or those kind of people. Well, we're going to provide an opportunity for you to meet these people and to go to these places and your country in whatever capacity that you may have gifts. Sure, that's all right. You know, we'll find a place where you'll be able to work. Maybe not in the office you'd like to work, with the people that you would rather not work with, but it'll do you good, and it will do us all good. The society will do. You know, when you think of the divisions in this country still today, that a lot of good things happened, for instance, from World War II, Vietnam, and so forth, when they integrated troops. That was absolutely never, I will never serve with a black guy in my foxhole or whatever, you know. Well, you're going to. And you found out that the guy, maybe even better than I am. So it changes the whole perspective. And it basically took World War II for that to happen. Because even during World War II, you know, when all these millions of troops in England, you know, and the invasion and so forth, the blacks were welcomed in England. They didn't have that kind of distinction. They had a class distinction, but they didn't have a racial distinction. So the blacks felt so much more comfortable in Europe, in England, and in the foxhole. And they came home and weren't allowed in the same coach of the train and couldn't eat when the train would stop in that restaurant after endangering their life in the war, you know. And it was people like Truman and so forth that began making these changes. Blacks being buried at Arlington, you've got to be kidding. I'm going to share a cemetery, my grave. Yes, you are.
Well, obviously, the military and your services had a profound effect upon your life, and we appreciate you taking the time to share a most fascinating story with us. We thank you for welcoming us into your home, and we thank you for your service. And it's been a real pleasure meeting you, sir.
Thank you very much.